Can you get kicked out of the military for a domestic violence conviction? This is a very important topic, and that's going to be what we discuss in this video. So if this hits home, then you're definitely going to want to watch because it is packed with some really good information. Before we get into it, I just want to shout out the military. So all my military personnel, thank you so much for your service. Actually, for me, I have a number of special connections to the military in that my late father was a Marine. So he served his country for almost 3 decades. I have my younger cousin, Terrence. So shout out to Terrence, shout out to my uncle, Jerome. Both were Marines. And actually some of my closest friends both were and still are in the military. Being in San Diego, we have the naval base, and then up the road in Oceanside, where I grew up, you have Camp Pendleton. So we have a very heavy military presence down here. You know, it's no secret at all that our military personnel really just go through a lot mentally, emotionally, and physically. Very strong men, but you know, they go through it, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, folks find themselves being arrested for domestic violence. And so for anybody, no matter what your profession is, it can be it is a big concern to be arrested, right? The prospect of going to jail or going to prison is a huge concern for anybody. But for military personnel, there's the added concern of the possibility of getting kicked out of the military, and that's what we're addressing in this video. So we're going to talk about a story of a man named Rick, right? So Rick is not his real name, but that's the name that we're going to use for this story, right? And so Rick has moved his way up the ranks in the military. So he's in the Navy. He's proudly served his country for almost 30 years. And in those 30 years, Rick has seen a lot. I mean, he's been to war. He's had fellow sailors pass on. So Rick has a wife. Her name is Denise. He loves and appreciates her. They have 2 kids who are in college, and Rick is proud to support them as they make their way through school. So while Rick and Denise love each other very much, things have been tense in the home lately. Denise and Rick end up getting into it over one of the kids who was actually doing a bit more partying than studying while away at school. And so Rick, who has been financially supporting the kids, he's ready to lay down the heavy hand, right? While Denise wants to give some grace. So there's an argument between these two in terms of how the situation should be handled. And unfortunately, the argument escalates and Rick and Denise are now yelling at each other. So at a certain point, Rick actually ends up approaching Denise and he puts his hands on both sides of her head and basically says, hey, you just don't get it, right? So he's screaming at her at this point. Denise screams and she starts crying. And Rick is pissed. He throws a beer bottle and it breaks. Now, they live in an apartment building, and so the sliding glass door is open, so they just have the screen. And you can hear it, right? So the walls are somewhat thin, but also the glass door is open. So one of the neighbors overhears the commotion and decides to call 911. So about 30 to 40 minutes later, Rick and Denise hear a knock on the door. San Diego Police Department. They look at each other in shock because, you know, they're like, why are police at our door, right? Neither one of them called the police. So Rick goes to open the door and he's confused. He asks, well, you know, what's going on? So the officer says, hey, well, you know, we received a complaint from one of the neighbors. Can we come in and talk? So Rick is reluctant and says, yeah, I guess you can come in. And the one officer starts talking to him. The other officer goes in and starts talking to Denise. And so Rick and Denise, they're separated. They're both giving their sides of the story in terms of what ultimately happened. Both are concerned at this point, and they're both saying things to, you know, protect themselves while they don't necessarily want to throw the other one under the bus, but there's a self-preservation element here going on. So the officer that was talking to Denise pulls out his camera phone and starts taking pictures of her. And she has red marks on both sides of her face where, you know, Rick had grabbed her. Her makeup was smeared from her crying, and the neck of her shirt had been kind of stretched. You could tell that it had been pulled. And so officers, they're going around, they're taking pictures of the apartment. There had been some things that were thrown around in addition to that beer bottle that Rick broke. So the officers step aside and they start talking amongst themselves, and they eventually approach Rick and they tell him, hey, I'm sorry, but you're under arrest for felony domestic violence. And Rick's like, hey, are you kidding me? Like, I didn't do anything wrong, right? And Denise is saying, hey, what's going on here? I said I didn't want to press charges. Please let him go. So she's basically begging, and the officer's like, well, sorry, that's just going to have to be something that you take up with the judge. The officers handcuff Rick. They put him in the back of the patrol vehicle and take him to jail. And so Denise then calls a bail bonds company, and after a few hours, Rick ends up getting out of custody. And, even though it was just a few hours, it was an absolutely terrible experience for Rick. And he knew that he never, ever wanted to see the inside of a jail cell ever again. Rick had been given a piece of paper that let him know that he would have a court date for his felony domestic violence charge in about 30 days. So Rick had remembered that he had a friend named Jeff who years ago had been arrested for domestic violence. So he calls Jeff and he says, hey, didn't you get arrested for domestic violence a few years back? And Jeff is like, yeah, I got arrested, but dude, I showed up to court and nothing happened. No charges were filed, and I was able to just kind of go about my life. And so Jeff tells Rick, hey, man, don't worry about it. A lot of times these things just go away on their own. And the reality is sometimes people do get arrested, especially for domestic violence, and for whatever reason, charges ultimately don't get filed. And so Rick was at this point, he's still upset that he got arrested, but he's concerned. And now he's like kicking around the idea of like, should I tell my command or not? So he's nervous at this point because he's thinking like, am I going to get kicked out of the military? So he doesn't know what to do. Denise was upset about this situation because Rick ended up getting arrested, and she felt like she was manipulated by the police because, after all, she told them, hey, I don't want to press charges. And so when the police conduct a domestic violence investigation, at a certain point, there are two questions that they're going to ask an alleged victim. Number one is, do you desire prosecution? Number two is, if there is a court case, will you participate in the process? And again, dealing with the military, a lot of people come from out of state, and so they're not familiar with California's laws on domestic violence. And so what a lot of people don't understand is that even if the answers to those questions are no, right, that the person does not desire prosecution, and they say they will not participate in the process, officers can and will still arrest a person, right? So the whole thing of an alleged victim pressing charges is not really a thing here in California. In California, the prosecutor, so the people of the state of California, are the ones who determine, and that's by way of the district attorney, they're the ones who determine whether charges are going to be filed against a person, not the alleged victim. At this point, they know that Rick got arrested. They know that he has a court date coming up. And Denise felt like pretty hopeful because she had an idea that came to mind. She said, hey, well, what if I just call the police and I tell them, hey, I don't want this case to move forward? And Rick's like, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's try that. So Denise makes a few calls to San Diego Police Department, and eventually she gets connected to the officer who is assigned to the case. So she repeated that she did not want the case to move forward. She did not want to press charges. In fact, she didn't even want to see Rick get arrested, and she wasn't even the person that called 911. So she was hoping that that would be persuasive enough for the officer to perhaps close out the case, but unfortunately the officer was no help at all. He said, basically, it's out of our hands now. You'll need to talk to the DA. Denise is frustrated with the answer, but she's like, okay, well, let me try and call the DA. So she calls the DA's office and ends up basically getting the runaround. No one ultimately helped her with making the case go away. So they're pretty much desperate at this point. The police have shut them down. The DA was not helpful, so they decided to look out for a defense attorney. So Rick goes on YouTube and starts searching for information, and he came across this video that I'll link here somewhere. He watched that video and decided to give us a call. And we had an initial strategy session, and he was so impressed how there was no pressure involved. There was no judgment at all. We got to take the time to really know about what happened with his situation, what his concerns were, what his fears were, what he was looking for in somebody who would help him out in this situation. And so we let him know what his options were, and he decided to move forward with our firm. So the court date was approaching, and Denise had let us know that she had already tried reaching out to the police and the DA to somehow make the case go away and had no success. She was also hoping that maybe she could talk to the judge, and we gave her the unfortunate news that this would probably not be helpful either. So we had, as part of this process, reached out to the Navy legal defense team. After all, it was really important to know, in the worst case scenario, what might become of Rick's future in the Navy. And unfortunately, the answer basically hit Rick like a ton of bricks. We were informed that if he were charged and convicted, he was going to get dishonorably discharged, no questions asked. And not only that, but he would lose his retirement benefits as well. And you can only imagine just how serious this was for Rick and Denise. I mean, everything they had worked so hard for was now at stake. I mean, the possibility of going to jail was bad enough, but getting kicked out of the military was just unthinkable. And so we had a plan, right? And it was time to put the plan to work. So we had our amazing investigator, Christina, reach out to Denise. Christina interviewed Denise and put together a really solid report of what ended up happening on the date in question. We also collected a bunch of letters of support from friends, family members, co-workers, ex-bosses, just all kinds of people who were willing to say wonderful things about Rick. We also collected his awards and commendations. And Rick had acknowledged that he had some anger issues, had some PTSD, and he drank a little too much, right? So we got him into anger management. He started doing some therapy, and he was doing a few AA sessions a week. Rick was willing to do whatever he could to take care of this situation. By the time we ended up talking to the DA's office, we had over 50 pages of positive information to get over to them in our efforts to convince them not to move forward with charges against our client. And what you have to understand is, listen, police reports make people look like monsters. After all, the police have to justify why they found probable cause to arrest you. So I can guarantee that that police report is not going to be doing you any favors. And that's why it's so important that we collect the positive information in order to balance out how bad a police report is going to make you look. So thankfully, the DA was very impressed with Rick's efforts. And one of the things that you'll learn is that DAs are really concerned, DAs and judges are really concerned with doing whatever they can to prevent a similar situation from happening again. So one thing that clients can do to help themselves is, if they have any issues, if there was underlying PTSD, there's underlying substance abuse or alcoholism or anger issues, if you can take the steps to address those issues, to demonstrate to a DA and to the judge that something like this is never going to happen again, then that's going to go a very long way in negotiations. In the end, the DA agreed to exercise her discretion and declined to file charges against Rick. And needless to say, Rick and Denise were very thankful. They were relieved. They were happy that they did not just follow Jeff's advice, leave it up to chance, and just hope that when he went to court that the case would go away. Maybe for Jeff and for a lot of people, that is enough, right? To just say, oh, well, I'll just wait and see what happens. I'll just show up to court and hope for the best. At the end of the day, for Rick and Denise, there was simply too much at stake. They had to take a proactive approach to this situation. And just so you know, people who are charged with the crime have a right to a lawyer at the expense of the government. In other words, a free lawyer, right? And this would be a public defender. But one of the problems with going with the public defender's office is you cannot talk to a lawyer before your court date. So, where Rick got out of jail on March 2nd and his hearing wasn't until early April, that whole 4 weeks, he would have just been in the dark, right? Because you can't just call up the public defender and say, hey, I'd like to get your thoughts on my case, or can you give me some advice, or can you start working on my case? Like, none of that. Really, in reality, if you have a public defender, you're not going to get a chance to talk to somebody, and you're not even going to meet your lawyer until just a few minutes before you're in front of the judge. And there's not that time to start building your case and going over strategy and conducting an investigation and doing all those things. There's just not an opportunity to do that. So Rick getting arrested and going to jail was absolutely a rock bottom period of his life, but he's since turned it around. He's still in therapy. He continues to go to AA sessions. His relationship with Denise is better than ever, and his children are very proud of their father and his progress. Every case is different. Not every case has the same happy ending as Rick and Denise's situation. And even if you have a solid defense attorney in your corner, but the reality is having an excellent and experienced criminal defense firm in your corner basically puts you in the best possible position for a favorable outcome. So if you're in a position where there's just too much at stake to leave things to chance, then it's worth it for you to hire a law firm that will truly go to bat for you. My name is Jamal Kersey. I'm the principal attorney at Kersey Law. We are a boutique criminal defense firm in San Diego, California, and I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, please show me some love and hit the like button. You can subscribe to the channel and make sure you turn on those notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.